Rain lashed against the warped window pane of the drawing room, dissolving the rolling Yorkshire hills into a wash of gray sludge. Margaret didn't look out. She stared instead at the thick parchment resting on the mahogany desk, its heavy wax seal fractured straight down the middle. Smith's crest. He was arriving today to sign the papers, to sever the final rotting thread holding them together. Her hands shook, not from heartbreak, but from the sudden vicious kick beneath her ribs. 6 months gone, and he had absolutely no idea. The fire in the hearth was struggling, sputtering against the damp soot that clogged the chimney of the old manor. Margaret adjusted her posture in the wingback chair, stifling a grimace. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that had become her constant companion since November. She shifted her weight, feeling the heavy, unyielding pull of her belly beneath the voluminous layers of black wool. She was in mourning for her uncle. It was a convenient tragedy. The excessive yardage of crepe and bombazine required for proper bereavement effectively swallowed her altered silhouette, hiding the swelling truth of her condition from the sparse staff at Oakhaven. A draft swept through the floorboards, carrying the scent of wet earth and stale lavender. Margaret pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. She felt gross. Her ankles were swollen, pressing painfully against the stiff leather of her boots, and a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated her nape despite the freezing room. This wasn't how a duchess prepared to face her estranged husband. There was no tragic beauty here, no porcelain skin and dignified silence. There was only exhaustion, a sour stomach, and the metallic taste of anxiety in her mouth. The distant, rhythmic crunch of gravel reached her ears over the sound of the rain. Margaret's breath hitched. She pressed a hand flat against her abdomen. "Stop," she thought, a silent plea directed at the life churning inside her. "Just be still for 1 hour." The heavy thud of the oak front door reverberated through the floorboards. Muffled voices echoed in the entryway. Her aging butler, Thomas, and the sharp, clipped baritone that made the fine hairs on Margaret's arms stand up. Smith. She closed her eyes, listening to the heavy tread of his boots on the stairs. He didn't walk like a man burdened by the collapse of a marriage. He walked like a landlord coming to collect rent. Efficient, relentless. "His Grace, the Duke of Somerset," Thomas announced, his voice cracking slightly as he opened the drawing-room door. Margaret didn't stand. She couldn't. The sheer physical effort required to hoist herself up from the deep chair without looking like a stranded beetle was beyond her current capabilities. Instead, she lifted her chin, fixing her gaze on the doorway. Smith stepped into the room. He looked exactly the same and entirely different. He wore a dark riding coat, its shoulders darkened by the rain, smelling strongly of wet wool, horse sweat, and the sharp, clean scent of cold air. His dark hair was plastered against his forehead, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. He looked tired. The skin around his eyes was bruised with exhaustion, pulling taut over his cheekbones. He didn't look at her immediately. His gaze swept the room, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the smoking hearth, the threadbare Persian rug, judging it, judging her exile. "Margaret," he said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of inflection. "Smith." She kept her hands folded over her lap, hidden beneath the cascading fringe of her shawl. "You made good time despite the mud." "I rode ahead of the carriage. The roads are turning to soup. I wanted to get this over with before the river floods." He stripped off his leather gloves, slapping them against his thigh, scattering a fine mist of raindrops. He finally looked at her. Margaret braced herself, expecting the familiar sting of his contempt, but there was only a flat, terrifying blankness in his eyes. They had spent 3 years tearing each other apart, screaming matches that shattered porcelain, quiet, venomous remarks across dining tables long enough to seat 20, and finally, the suffocating silence. The fire had burned out. Only the ash remained. "You look pale," he noted, stepping toward the desk where the papers lay. He didn't ask how she was. He stated a fact. "The country air agrees with me," Margaret lied smoothly. "It's merely the lighting." Smith didn't push. He didn't care. He pulled a silver flask from his inner pocket, unscrewed the cap, and took a short, sharp pull. He didn't offer her any. He set the flask down beside the divorce decree. "My solicitors have drawn it up exactly as we discussed," Smith said, pulling out the heavy leather chair opposite her and sitting heavily. "The settlement is generous. Oakhaven is yours, along with the London townhouse on Berkeley Square, an allowance of $5,000 a year. You forfeit the title, naturally, and any claim to the Somerset estates." Margaret stared at the thick stack of paper. The finality of it felt like a physical blow, heavier than she had anticipated. She had wanted this. She had begged for this back in May, throwing a crystal decanter at his head when she found out about his trip to Paris, the trip he took while she was recovering from her third miscarriage, the trip he took without her. "5,000 is more than adequate," she said, her voice sounding thin, even to her own ears. "I don't want you starving in the damp," he muttered, pulling an inkwell closer. He unstoppered it, the sharp scent of iron gall filling the space between them. "I just want this done, Margaret. I want to move on." "To an heir," she said. The words slipped out before she could bite them back. Bitter, cynical, unnecessary. Smith's hand froze. He looked up slowly, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The blankness fractured, revealing a flicker of the old, familiar resentment. "Don't do that," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Don't play the victim. Not today. We both know why we're sitting here. We are toxic to each other. We built a graveyard out of a marriage. Let's just bury it and walk away." Margaret swallowed hard. Her throat clicked audibly in the quiet room. He was right. It was a graveyard. She had buried 3 tiny, unnamed ghosts in the family plot. And now, ironically, miraculously, when the marriage was a rotting corpse, her body had finally decided to hold on. She felt another sharp roll in her abdomen, a heel, perhaps, pressing against her bladder. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, digging her fingernails into her palms. Not now. "Pass me the pen," she said quietly. Smith held the silver fountain pen out to her across the expanse of the desk. He didn't lean in. He forced her to reach for it. Margaret hesitated. To sign the paper meant reaching across the table. It meant shifting her weight, leaning forward, and compromising the careful fortress of wool and shadow she had constructed around herself. "Margaret." Smith's tone was clipped, impatient. "It's just ink. It won't bite." She clenched her jaw. Grabbing the arms of the chair, she pushed herself forward. The sudden movement sent a spike of searing pain through her round ligaments. She gasped, a short, sharp sound that she couldn't suppress, and slumped back into the upholstery, her hand flying to her side. Smith frowned, the pen still hovering over the desk. "What is wrong with you?" "Nothing." Margaret panted lightly, trying to breathe through the sudden cramp. The room felt unbearably hot now. The sputtering fire seemed to be baking the air, suffocating her. "A cramp. The damp settles in my joints." "You are 24, not 80, Smith snapped, though his eyes narrowed, lingering on her face. "You're sweating. Have you caught a chill?" "I am perfectly fine," she hissed, defensive anger flaring. She hated that he was looking at her. She hated the vulnerability of her body, the way it betrayed her at every turn. "Just give me the damn pen, Smith." He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he placed it on the parchment and sat back, crossing his arms over his chest. "Sign it, then." Margaret took a deep breath, fighting the nausea rolling in her stomach. The metallic smell of the ink was making it worse. She leaned forward again, slower this time. The heavy black wool of her morning gown bunched up around her waist. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they closed around the cold silver barrel of the pen. She dragged the papers toward her. The legal jargon was a blur of black script, irreconcilable differences, annulment of duties, severance of bonds. "Read it first," Smith said, watching her intently. I don't want your lawyers crawling out of the woodwork in 6 months claiming you were coerced." "I don't care what it says," Margaret muttered, dipping the pen into the inkwell. A drop of black fell onto the mahogany, soaking into the grain. "You've bought me off. We both have what we want." "Do we?" he asked softly. Margaret paused, the nib hovering a millimeter above the signature line. She looked up at him. The sheer exhaustion in his voice had caught her off guard. "You want your freedom," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You want a clean slate. A new, young, healthy wife who won't bleed out your heirs before they can draw a breath." Smith flinched. It was a microscopic movement, just a tightening of the skin around his eyes, but she saw it. "That isn't fair, Margaret." "Fair?" A bitter, ugly laugh escaped her lips. "Fairness left this house a long time ago. You left me in that London bedchamber crying over blood-soaked sheets while you went to France." "I couldn't watch it again." Smith's voice cracked like a whip in the small room. He leaned forward, planting his hands flat on the desk. The stoic veneer vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged grief that made Margaret's breath catch. "I couldn't watch them carry out another bloody basin, Margaret. I couldn't watch you die a little more every time, and I couldn't stand the way you looked at me afterward, like I was a monster for putting you through it." "You were a coward," she spat, her own chest heaving. The baby, agitated by her elevated heart rate, began a frantic drumming against her ribs. "Maybe," Smith admitted, his voice dropping to a defeated rasp. He sank back into his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "Maybe I was. But I'm here now, doing the decent thing, setting you free." "Setting yourself free," she corrected him. "Fine. Setting us both free. Just sign the paper, Margaret. Please." She looked down at the paper. Margaret Eleanor Harrington, Duchess of Somerset. She would never write that name again. She pressed the nib to the paper. M-A-R-G. A sharp, violent spasm ripped through her abdomen. It wasn't a kick. It was a contraction. Braxton Hicks, the midwife in the village, had called them, but this one was vicious. It stole the breath entirely from her lungs. Margaret dropped the pen. It clattered against the desk, splattering ink across the parchment. She doubled over, clutching her stomach with both hands, a low groan escaping her clenched teeth. The shawl slipped from her shoulders, pooling on the floor. "Margaret?" Smith stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the wood floor. "Margaret, what is it?" She couldn't speak. The tightness radiated from her back around to the front, squeezing her like a vice. She turned away from him, curling inward, burying her face in the upholstery of the wingback chair to muffle her breathing. "Thomas!" Smith shouted toward the door, his footsteps heavy as he rounded the desk. "Thomas, get in here!" "No!" Margaret gasped out, forcing herself to sit up, holding a hand out to stop him. "No, don't call him. I'm fine. It's passing." Smith stopped a few feet from her. He looked down. Without the thick, draping coverage of the shawl, the cut of her morning dress did very little to hide the truth. She was slumped backward, her posture defeated, and the solid, undeniable mound of her abdomen pressed taut against the black wool. The silence in the room became absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like hammer blows. Smith stood entirely still. His eyes were locked on her stomach. The color drained from his face so rapidly, Margaret thought he might actually pass out. The raw, angry energy he had carried across the room evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying stillness. He didn't ask, "What is that?" He wasn't a fool. He knew exactly what the shape of a pregnant woman looked like. He had seen it on her 3 times before, though never quite this large. "What?" Smith started, his voice a broken, raspy whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What is this?" Margaret pushed herself upright, her hands still resting instinctively over the crest of her belly. The contraction had faded, leaving her trembling and utterly exposed. There was no hiding anymore. The rot was pulled back, and the truth was sitting right there in the damp, freezing room with them. "I'm pregnant," she said. She aimed for defiant, but it came out exhausted. Smith took a slow, unsteady step backward until the back of his knees hit the edge of the desk. He leaned against it, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wood. He stared at her, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. 6 months, he breathed, doing the math. His eyes snapped up to her face, wide and manic. 6 months, May, before I left for Paris. Yes, he let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, a jagged, ugly noise. "You are 6 months pregnant, and you didn't tell me." "Why would I?" Margaret shot back, her defenses slamming into place. The adrenaline made her hands shake. "We haven't spoken a single word to one another in half a year. You sent your lawyers to communicate for you. You packed me up and shipped me to Yorkshire like a broken piece of furniture." "It is my child!" he roared, the sudden volume making Margaret flinch. He pushed off the desk, stalking toward her. He stopped just inches from her knees, towering over her. The smell of cold rain and scotch radiating off him was overwhelming. "It is my heir. You have no right to hide this from me." "Right?" Margaret barked a cynical laugh, looking up at him without blinking. "Don't talk to me about rights, Smith. I am the vessel, remember? That's all I ever was. The incubator that kept failing. Well, congratulations. The incubator finally took, but you had already checked out." Smith stared down at her, his jaw trembling. He slowly reached a hand out, his fingers hovering inches from the black wool covering her stomach. He looked terrified to touch her, as if she might shatter, or worse, burn him. "Is it—" He swallowed violently. "Is it healthy? Are you bleeding?" The question hit her harder than his anger. The sheer, traumatic panic in his voice stripped away the Duke and left only the man who had held her hand while she lost their previous children. "No," Margaret said quietly, the fight draining out of her. She slumped back into the chair. "No bleeding. The midwife says the heartbeat is strong. It kicks constantly. It's healthy, Smith." Smith's hand dropped. He staggered back, dragging his hands through his damp hair, tugging at the roots. He began to pace the short expanse of the rug, his boots thudding against the floorboards. "You were going to sign the papers," he muttered, talking more to himself than to her. He stopped and pointed an accusatory finger at the desk. "You were going to take a £5,000 settlement and walk away, with my child. You were going to let me divorce you, ruin your reputation, and raise my son in secret? It might be a girl," she pointed out dryly. "I don't give a damn what it is," he shouted, kicking the heavy mahogany leg of the desk. The inkwell rattled. "It's mine. How could you do this? How could you sit there and let me talk about annulments and settlements while you're carrying my child?" "Because you didn't want me," Margaret yelled back, finally pushing herself to her feet. Her joints screamed in protest, but she stood, planting her feet wide for balance. She met his furious gaze, her own eyes burning, though she refused to cry. "You want an heir, Smith. You never wanted a wife. You couldn't handle the mess of me, the grief, the blood. You ran to Paris because it was easier than looking at a woman who was broken. So I decided to spare you the trouble. You get your clean slate, and I get the child. I wasn't going to let you taint this one with your resentment." Smith flinched as if she had slapped him. He stared at her, the anger slowly draining from his face, replaced by a profound, agonizing devastation. "You think I resent you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I think you resent my failures," she said plainly, the cynical truth tasting like ash in her mouth. Smith looked away, staring into the sputtering fire. He stood there for a long time, the only sound in the room the harsh drumming of the rain against the glass. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The divorce papers lay on the desk, the ink from her dropped pen slowly bleeding across the parchment, obliterating the word irreconcilable. Finally, Smith turned back to her. He didn't look like a duke. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire worldview collapse. He walked over to the desk. He didn't say a word. He picked up the heavy silver pen, wiping the ink from the barrel with his bare thumb, not caring about the stain it left on his skin. He grabbed the thick stack of divorce papers. Margaret watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What are you doing?" Smith walked past her, ignoring the question. He stopped in front of the fireplace. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the entire stack of parchment into the sputtering flames. The dry paper caught instantly. The fire flared bright and hot, illuminating the harsh lines of his face as the wax seal melted and the words burned to ash. "Get your things packed," Smith said, his back still to her as he watched their separation burn. "We are going back to London." Acrid smoke billowed from the fireplace, carrying the sharp chemical scent of melting sealing wax. Margaret stared at the blackening edges of the parchment curling in the flames. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven intervals. He had burned them, just like that. 3 months of agonizing negotiations, the solicitors, the silent carriage rides, the finality she had spent half a year wrapping around herself like a bruised armor, reduced to a pile of gray ash currently floating up the chimney. "I'm not going anywhere," Margaret said. She gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles bleached white. "You don't get to march in here, burn my autonomy, and issue orders." Smith turned slowly. The frantic terror from minutes ago had been shoved down, replaced by a cold, rigid authority that Margaret recognized all too well. It was the face he wore when a horse broke its leg and needed shooting, or when a tenant farm went bankrupt. Pragmatic. Absolute. "You are pregnant with the Duke of Somerset's heir," Smith said, his voice flat, though a slight tremor in his fingers betrayed him as he buttoned his damp riding coat. "You're living in a drafty, rotting manor 50 miles from a competent physician. The roads are turning to slurry. You're coming back to Berkeley Square where I can ensure you do not die in a puddle of rainwater. I have a midwife in the village, Mrs. Higgins. She delivered half the county." "Mrs. Higgins is a peasant who likely washes her hands in a horse trough," Smith snapped, stepping toward her. He didn't yell this time. He didn't have to. The quiet intensity in his baritone was infinitely more suffocating. "You are packing a trunk, Margaret. If you refuse to walk to the carriage, I will have Thomas help me carry you down the stairs. Do not test my resolve today. I do not have the stomach for it." He meant it. The sheer, terrifying stubbornness in his dark eyes left absolutely no room for debate. Margaret swallowed the bitter taste of defeat. Her lower back was throbbing again, a dull, rhythmic ache that promised misery. She was tired. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard, making her limbs feel like lead. The thought of fighting him physically was exhausting. 2 hours later, she was wedged into the corner of the Somerset-crested carriage. The rain had intensified, drumming a relentless, chaotic beat against the lacquered roof. Inside, the air was thick, smelling of damp leather, Smith's wet wool coat, and the faint, sour tang of her own nausea. The carriage jolted violently as the wheel caught a deep rut in the mud. Margaret gasped, her hands flying to the sides of her swollen belly. Pain, sharp and immediate, flared in her pelvis. Smith, sitting rigidly on the opposite bench, lunged forward. His hands hovered over her knees, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the rain-streaked glass. "Are you all right? Are you bleeding?" "Stop asking me if I'm bleeding," she hissed through gritted teeth, squeezing her eyes shut until the ache subsided to a dull throb. "It's a rut, Smith. The baby bounces when the carriage bounces. It is deeply unpleasant, but I am not dying." He slowly withdrew his hands, sinking back against the squabs. He looked out the window, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle jumped beneath his skin. "I told the driver to keep a steady pace. He's driving like a damn drunkard. He's driving through a foot of Yorkshire mud. You are the one who insisted on leaving today." "I insisted on getting you to a sterile environment," he muttered, running a hand over his face. He looked ragged. The stoic Duke had completely unraveled. He kept glancing at her midsection, his eyes darting down and then quickly snapping away, as if looking directly at her pregnancy was like staring into an eclipse. "You haven't asked," Margaret said quietly, the rhythmic creak of the leather harnesses filling the silence between them. Smith looked at her. "Asked what?" "If it's a boy." "I don't care." The response was immediate, sharp, and defensive. Margaret let out a short, cynical breath. "Of course you care. It's the entire point of my existence, isn't it? The heir, the spare, the legacy." "Stop it," Smith warned, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Stop talking like that. You think you know everything I'm feeling right now, Margaret, but you don't have a clue. I watched you bleed out 3 times. I watched you turn into a ghost. You think I care about a title right now? I am trying to keep you alive." "You left." The words hung in the suffocating air of the carriage. They were the truest, ugliest things she could say. Smith's face hardened. He looked away, staring into the gray sludge of the passing landscape. He didn't defend himself. He couldn't. "I know," he said softly, the sound almost lost under the drumming rain. "I know." The rest of the journey to London took 3 agonizing days. They stopped at roadside inns where Smith bullied innkeepers into giving up their best rooms, demanding extra fires, boiling water, and fresh linens. He stood guard outside her door like a rabid dog. He wouldn't let her carry so much as a teacup. It wasn't affection. It was an aggressive, terrifying overcompensation. It was a man trying to physically wrestle fate into submission. And it was exhausting. The London townhouse smelled exactly as Margaret remembered, a cloying mixture of beeswax, expensive dust, and heavy, forced air heating. When Thomas opened the grand front doors, the shock on the faces of the staff was palpable. They had seen the Duchess sent away in disgrace, or what society assumed was disgrace. Now she was returning, heavily pregnant, leaning heavily on the Duke's arm. Smith didn't give them time to gawk. "Fetch Mrs. Gable," he barked at a stunned footman. "Have the green suite on the first floor prepared immediately. Light every fire, and send someone to Harley Street. I want Dr. Chadwick here within the hour." Margaret stopped dead in the foyer. Her boots squeaked against the black and white marble tiles. She pulled her arm free from Smith's grip. "The green suite?" she repeated, her heart rate spiking, sending a rush of cold sweat down her spine. "No, Smith turned back, impatient. "It has the fewest stairs, Margaret. You shouldn't be climbing." "I said no." Her voice cracked. The green suite, the room with the heavy velvet curtains where she had been confined during her second pregnancy. The room where the blood had soaked through 3 layers of mattress ticking, the smell of copper so thick in the air she had vomited off the side of the bed. Smith looked at her, annoyance flashing across his features before comprehension finally dawned. He saw the panic rising in her chest, the way her breathing had suddenly gone shallow. The color drained from his face. He remembered. Of course he remembered. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He turned back to the terrified footman. "The East Wing guest rooms, the blue ones, air them out. Now." Margaret let out a shaky breath, pressing her hand against the wall for support. The baby, sensing her distress, gave a hard, rolling kick against her ribs. She winced, rubbing the spot through her heavy wool cloak. "Let's get you upstairs," Smith said quietly. He didn't grab her arm this time. He hovered his hand an inch behind her waist, a phantom support, terrified to touch her but desperate to catch her if she fell. The blue room was unfamiliar. It smelled of lavender sachets and disuse. It didn't have ghosts. Margaret sat on the edge of the large 4-poster bed, allowing a maid to unlace her boots. Her feet were swollen, the leather having left deep red indents in her skin. Dr. Chadwick arrived in a flurry of wet umbrellas and clinking leather bags. He was an older man, smelling sharply of iodine, peppermint, and cigar smoke. Smith was banished to the hallway. Margaret heard him pacing, the heavy thud of his boots tracking back and forth across the hardwood, Chadwick's hands were freezing as he pressed them against her bare abdomen, measuring the fundal height, listening through his wooden stethoscope. "Strong heartbeat," the doctor murmured, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in concentration. "Very active, but you're carrying low, Your Grace, and your blood pressure is concerning. The journey from Yorkshire was ill-advised." "I didn't have a choice," Margaret muttered, staring at the ornate plasterwork on the ceiling. "You have a choice now," Chadwick said sternly, pulling the blankets back up over her. "Complete bed rest. You're not to navigate stairs. You're to remain horizontal for the majority of the day. The previous complications make this a precarious trimester. Your body is under immense strain." When Smith was allowed back into the room, he looked like a man walking to his own execution. Chadwick delivered the verdict. Bed rest, stress reduction, no sudden movements. Smith nodded once, his face an impenetrable mask of stoicism. He escorted the doctor out, paying him handsomely, and then returned, closing the heavy mahogany door behind him with a soft click. He stood at the foot of the bed, staring at her. She looked small amidst the mountain of white pillows, her dark hair a tangled mess against the linens. "Bed rest," he repeated. "I heard him," Margaret said wearily, turning her head to look out the window. The London fog was rolling in, thick and suffocating. "I will have the staff bring up a dining table. I'll work from the sitting room next door. You won't be left alone." "Smith," she sighed, closing her eyes. "I don't need a warden." "You need to stay alive," he snapped, the mask cracking. He gripped one of the bedposts, his knuckles white. "You think you can just banish me? You think I'm going to sit in my club sipping brandy while you lay here? I missed 6 months of this. I am not missing the rest." "You missed 6 months because you didn't want to look at me," she fired back, the resentment flaring hot and fast. She pulled herself up against the pillows, wincing at the pull in her lower back. "Don't pretend this is about devotion. This is about guilt. You feel guilty that you abandoned me, and now you are trying to suffocate me with supervision to make up for it." "Of course it's guilt," he shouted, throwing his hands up. The outburst echoed off the high ceilings. He began to pace again, rubbing the back of his neck. "I am drowning in it, Margaret. I wake up every day hating myself, but I can't undo it. I can only do this. I can only sit outside that door and make sure you don't bleed to death while I'm not looking." The sheer ugly honesty of it stunned her into silence. He wasn't playing the stoic duke anymore. He was raw, bleeding out his own kind of grief on the carpet. Margaret looked down at her hands, the gold of her wedding band catching the dim light. She hadn't taken it off. She had meant to, 12 times, but her fingers had swelled in the 4th month, and it was stuck. A physical trap. "Just sit down," she whispered. Smith stopped pacing. He looked at her, wary, before pulling a heavy velvet chair to the side of the bed. He sat heavily, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The scent of his damp wool coat and the faint smell of scotch wafted over her. They sat in silence as the afternoon faded into a murky London evening. The fire cracked in the hearth. It wasn't peace. It was a ceasefire. The 3rd week of January brought a bitter, biting cold that frosted the windows of the townhouse from the inside. Margaret hated the bed. It felt like a coffin made of down feathers. Her days blurred into a monotonous cycle of tepid broth, the ticking of the mantel clock, and the suffocating presence of her husband. Smith was true to his word. He worked from a small writing desk he had moved into the corner of her bedroom. He took his meals with her. He read the Times aloud to her, his voice a low, steady rumble that she stubbornly refused to admit she found soothing. He didn't try to touch her, and they didn't talk about the past. They existed in a fragile, terrifying bubble of anticipation. Then came the Tuesday morning. Margaret woke to a sharp, violent cramp that wrapped around her lower back and squeezed her abdomen with the force of a vice. She gasped, her eyes snapping open in the dim light. The room was freezing. The fire had died down to embers. "Braxton Hicks," she told herself, gritting her teeth. It's just a false labor. Drink some water. Breathe. She waited for it to pass. It didn't. Instead, a profound, sickening warmth spread between her thighs. Margaret froze. The blood roared in her ears, drowning out the ticking clock. She knew that feeling. She had felt it 3 times before. The sudden, terrifying release of fluid. She threw back the heavy-down comforter. The white cotton of her nightgown was stained, not with blood, but with clear, faintly pink fluid. Her water had broken. She was only 7 months along. "Smith," she whispered. Her voice failed her. It was a raspy squeak. She looked over at the writing desk. He had fallen asleep in the chair, his head resting on his crossed arms atop a pile of ledgers. Another cramp hit her, sharper this time, a knife twisting low in her pelvis. She let out a whimpering moan, clutching her stomach, her nails digging into the soft cotton. Smith jerked awake, papers scattering as he sat up. He blinked, disoriented for a fraction of a second before his eyes locked onto her on the bed. He saw her posture, curled inward, breathless, and he saw the dark, wet patch staining the sheets. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. The ledgers hit the floor with a deafening thud. "Margaret!" he breathed, lunging out of the chair. He crossed the room in 2 strides, falling to his knees beside the bed. His hands hovered over her, shaking violently. "No, no, no, no. It's too early. It's too early. It's broken," she sobbed, the panic finally breaking through her cynical armor. The terror was a physical weight crushing her chest. "Smith, it's too early. The baby—" "Quiet," he ordered, though his voice was cracking. He grabbed the bell pull hanging by the bed and yanked it so hard the velvet rope tore from the ceiling fixture. "Help! Mrs. Gable! Get the doctor!" He roared toward the closed door, the sound tearing from his throat, raw and panicked. He turned back to her, grabbing her cold, trembling hands in his. His palms were sweating. "Look at me, Margaret. Look at me." She couldn't. Her eyes were squeezed shut, riding out another wave of pain. The contractions were coming fast, stacking on top of each other with brutal efficiency. "Smith, it hurts!" she gasped out, tossing her head against the pillows. The smell of her own sweat and the metallic tang of fear filled her nose. "I know," he choked out. He leaned over her, pressing his forehead against hers. He smelled of stale ink, sleep, and absolute terror. "I know, God, I know. Just breathe, hold my hands, squeeze them." The bedroom door flew open. Mrs. Gable stood there, a candlestick in her hand, her mouth open in shock. "Get Chadwick," Smith screamed at her without turning around. "Send a boy on the fastest horse. Tell him to bring everything, now." The housekeeper vanished. The next 2 hours were a blur of agonizing pain and terrifying chaos. Maids rushed in and out with basins of hot water and stacks of clean towels, their faces pale and frightened. Smith refused to leave the room. When Mrs. Gable tried to usher him out, citing propriety, he threw a water pitcher at the wall, shattering it into 100 porcelain shards. "I am not leaving her," he roared, his chest heaving. "Do not ask me again." He stayed by the bed, his coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He held Margaret's hand, letting her dig her fingernails into his skin until crescent moon cuts bled on his knuckles. He wiped her face with a cool cloth. He murmured nonsense, prayers, apologies, anything to keep her tethered to the room as the pain threatened to drag her under. "I'm sorry," Margaret gasped during a brief lull, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. She looked up at him, her eyes blown wide with pain. "I'm sorry, I couldn't hold it. I tried—" "Don't apologize," Smith said roughly, his voice thick with unshed tears. He brushed a wet lock of hair from her cheek, his hand trembling. "Do not apologize to me. You are doing perfectly. You are so strong, Margaret. Just hold on. The doctor is coming." Dr. Chadwick arrived, looking disheveled, his overcoat hastily thrown over his nightshirt, The room smelled of hot water, sweat, and fear. He examined her quickly, his face grim. He pulled Smith aside, but the room was too quiet. Margaret heard every word. "She is fully dilated, Your Grace," Chadwick said in a hushed, urgent tone. "The child is coming, but at 7 months, the lungs are weak. You must prepare yourself. And the bleeding? Her uterus is tired. There's a high risk of hemorrhage." Smith grabbed the lapels of the doctor's coat, hauling the older man up onto his toes. The Duke's face was a mask of feral, desperate rage. "You save her," Smith snarled, his breath hitting the doctor's face. "Do you hear me? If you have to choose, you save my wife. I don't give a damn about the heir. You save Margaret." Margaret stared at the ceiling, the words washing over her. "You save my wife." Another contraction hit, ripping through her spine. She screamed, an ugly guttural sound that tore her throat. Smith dropped the doctor and rushed back to her side, grabbing her hands. "I'm here," he said fiercely, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving. Push, Margaret, push." The physical agony was blinding. It was a fire tearing through her pelvis, a pressure so immense she felt like her bones were snapping. She squeezed Smith's hands, bearing down with everything she had left, screaming until her voice gave out, replaced by a harsh, rattling wheeze. "Again, Your Grace," Chadwick ordered from the foot of the bed, his arms slick with fluid. "The head is here. One more push." Margaret sobbed, shaking her head. "I can't. Smith, I have nothing left." "Yes, you do," Smith pleaded, leaning down, pressing his face against her neck. His tears were hot against her cold skin. "You are the strongest person I've ever known. Do it for yourself, Maggie. Just one more." Maggie. He hadn't called her that since the first year of their marriage. She took a ragged, sobbing breath, closed her eyes, and pushed with a feral, agonizing groan. There was a sickening feeling of sliding pressure, a sudden wet release, and then silence. The absolute terrifying absence of sound. Margaret slumped back against the pillows, her chest heaving, staring at the ceiling. The room was completely still. There was no crying. Smith slowly stood up, looking toward the foot of the bed. His face was gray. "Doctor." "Chadwick?" Smith whispered, the sound cracking down the middle. The doctor was bent over a small table, working furiously with a tiny towel. The smell of copper hit the air, thick and metallic, the familiar smell of failure. Margaret closed her eyes, a single tear cutting through the sweat on her cheek. Not again. She felt Smith's weight shift on the mattress. He sat beside her, gathering her upper body into his arms, burying his face in her damp hair, his shoulders shaking as a silent masculine sob racked his frame. Then a sound. A tiny, wet, furious cough, followed by a thin, reedy wail that pierced the stifling air of the bedroom like a siren. Smith's head snapped up. Margaret's eyes flew open. "A boy, Your Grace," Chadwick said, his voice breathless with relief, turning around holding a tiny, purple, furious creature wrapped in a blood-stained towel. "He is small, very small, but he is breathing." Margaret stared at the writhing bundle. The sound of the cry was the most beautiful, violent noise she had ever heard. She reached out a trembling hand. Smith helped her sit up, his arm locked securely around her back. The doctor placed the tiny bundle onto Margaret's chest. The baby weighed almost nothing, a fragile bird with translucent skin and a shock of dark hair. He smelled of blood and life. Margaret pulled the towel back, pressing her palm against the tiny, rapidly beating chest. She looked up at Smith. He was staring at the baby, tears openly streaming down his face, completely stripping away the hardened, cynical Duke. He reached out a single finger. The baby, thrashing blindly, brushed against it. "He's breathing," Smith whispered, sounding utterly wrecked. He leaned in, pressing a kiss to Margaret's sweaty temple, his lips lingering against her skin. "You did it. You did it, Maggie." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted beyond words, feeling the solid, grounding warmth of him beside her. The divorce papers were ashes in Yorkshire. The ghosts of the Blue Room had been banished. They were battered, bleeding, and surrounded by the wreckage of their marriage. But as the tiny premature heir let out another angry wail against her chest, Margaret realized something profound. They were finally, truly, going to have to rebuild it. The Blue Room became a furnace. Dr. Chadwick ordered the fires banked high and 3 extra iron braziers brought in to combat the freezing London January. The air inside grew thick, tasting heavily of dry ash, burning coal, and the sharp, medicinal tang of eucalyptus leaves Smith threw onto the grates to keep the air clear. Margaret existed in a haze of localized pain and terrifying hypervigilance. Her body felt entirely foreign. Her pelvis felt as though it had been unbolted and carelessly reassembled, a deep, aching grind accompanying every shift of her hips. Her breasts were heavy, rock-hard, and feverish, leaking a sticky warmth that quickly turned sour on the cotton of her nightdresses. It was not beautiful. It was a messy, humiliating biology of survival. And then there was Henry. They had named him on the second day, a quiet, ragged agreement murmured over a bassinet that looked absurdly large for the creature inside it. Henry was a fragile, bruised-looking thing. His skin was translucent, mapping a delicate, terrifying network of blue veins across his skull. He didn't cry much. He didn't have the lung capacity for it. He mostly whickered, a thin, breathless sound that made Smith's jaw clench so tight the muscle visibly ticked. Feeding him was a nightmare. Henry was too weak to latch properly. A wet nurse, a robust woman smelling of oats and lanolin, was brought in, but the baby simply fell asleep against her breast, exhausted by the mere effort of trying to pull milk. "He's burning too much energy," Chadwick warned on the 4th morning, his fingers pressed against Henry's rapidly fluttering pulse. "If he doesn't take sustenance today, he will fade. His reserves are gone." Juanetta Margaret, propped up on a mountain of pillows, her hair plastered to her neck with sweat, felt a cold, jagged spike of adrenaline pierce her exhaustion. "No, give him to me." "Your Grace, you are in no condition," the wet nurse began. "Give me my son," Margaret snarled. It wasn't a request. Smith stepped forward, his eyes bloodshot, his linen shirt wrinkled and smelling faintly of stale sweat and fear. He hadn't left the room for more than 10 minutes at a time since the birth. He took the tiny bundle from the nurse and carried him to the bed. "How?" Smith asked softly, his voice raw. "He can't pull, Maggie. He's too tired." "Then we don't make him pull," she said, her fingers trembling as she unbuttoned the front of her nightgown. The cool air hit her overheated skin. She looked up at Smith. "Express it. Into a spoon." Smith blinked, the sheer domestic intimacy of the request catching him off guard. But the hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second. The Duke of Somerset, a man who had previously refused to look at the bloody realities of his marriage, rolled up his sleeves. He fetched a tiny silver teaspoon from the bedside tray. He sat on the edge of the mattress. Margaret guided his hands. It was awkward, painful, and deeply unglamorous. She hissed through her teeth as he clumsily applied pressure, the milk pooling slowly into the silver bowl of the spoon. Carefully, Smith brought the spoon to Henry's chapped, tiny lips. He tipped it. A single drop of milk spilled into the baby's mouth. Henry swallowed. A small, pathetic gulp. Smith let out a shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. He swallowed. "Again," Margaret ordered, a fierce, desperate heat rising in her chest. They sat there for an hour in the sweltering room, passing drops of life from her body to a silver spoon to the fragile throat of their son. Their hands brushed constantly. Smith's knuckles, still scarred with crescent moon cuts from her fingernails, smeared with spilled milk. Margaret's skin, damp with sweat, trembling with the effort of sitting upright. There was no romance in it. There was only dirt, exhaustion, and a desperate, frantic tethering to the life resting on Margaret's thighs. When Henry finally turned his head away and slipped into a deeper, milk-drunk sleep, Smith dropped the spoon into an empty teacup with a clatter. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. Margaret watched him. She saw the tremor in his broad shoulders. She reached out, her fingers brushing the dark, unkempt hair at the nape of his neck. He flinched at the touch, then leaned back into it, letting out a long, ragged exhale that sounded uncomfortably close to a sob. By the second week of February, the fog outside had turned to a relentless, freezing sleet. The townhouse felt entirely cut off from the rest of London. Henry was gaining weight. It was a terrifyingly slow process, measured in fractions of an ounce by a specialized brass scale Smith had demanded from a jeweler in Mayfair. The blue veins on the baby's head were fading, his cries turning from a breathless wheeze into a demanding, reedy wail. But as the immediate, crushing threat of death began to recede, the adrenaline that had fueled Margaret and Smith evaporated, leaving behind the jagged, unhealed wreckage of the past 3 years. It happened at 2 a.m. Margaret woke to the sound of Smith pacing. The braziers had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, shifting shadows across the flocked wallpaper. Henry was asleep in his bassinet. Smith was walking the length of the room, his boots making a soft, rhythmic thud against the carpet. He was clutching a half-empty glass of scotch. "You're going to wear a trench in the floorboards," Margaret whispered, her voice raspy from sleep. Smith stopped. He looked over at the bed. The shadows hollowed out his cheeks, making him look skeletal and haunted. He didn't apologize for waking her. He took a slow sip of the amber liquid, the ice clinking loudly in the quiet room. "I keep waiting for him to stop breathing," Smith said. It was a flat, clinical admission, stripped of all emotion, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "I sit in the chair, and I watch his chest rise. And then he pauses. Just for a second. And my heart stops beating until he takes the next breath." Margaret slowly pushed herself up against the headboard, pulling a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders. "Dr. Chadwick said his lungs are maturing. He's past the worst of it." "Chadwick is a physician, not a prophet," Smith muttered, staring into the scotch. He walked over to the fireplace, resting his free hand on the marble mantel. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the blood on the sheets, Margaret. From the other times, I see you looking at me like I am the devil himself." Margaret's chest tightened. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. They hadn't talked about it. They had survived the birth. They had fed the child, but they had carefully tiptoed around the graveyard that lay between them. "I didn't think you were the devil," she said quietly. "I thought you were a coward." Smith flinched. He set the glass down on the mantel with a sharp clack. "I was." "You couldn't fix it," Margaret continued, her voice gaining a cynical, necessary edge. "You're a duke. You're used to throwing money or authority at a problem until it resolves, but you couldn't buy a heartbeat for those babies. And you couldn't stand being useless. So you left me to drown in it alone." Smith turned to face her. The firelight caught the raw, wet sheen in his eyes. He didn't step toward the bed. He stayed anchored to the hearth, as if afraid his proximity might contaminate her. "I didn't leave because I couldn't fix the babies," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. "I left because I was killing you." And Margaret frowned, her brow furrowing. "What?" "Every time I touched you, you ended up bleeding," he spat, the self-loathing finally bubbling to the surface, toxic and scalding. He gripped the edge of the mantel until his knuckles turned bone white. "I put those children in you, and your body rejected them, and every single time you lost a piece of yourself. You were disappearing, Margaret. You were becoming a ghost. I couldn't look at you because looking at you meant acknowledging that I was the one doing it. My legacy was destroying you." Margaret stared at him, stunned. The sheer arrogance of his guilt was staggering, but beneath it lay a bruised, desperate logic that she had never considered. He hadn't gone to Paris to escape her grief. He had gone to Paris to remove the weapon, himself. "So you decided to divorce me," she said, testing the weight of the realization. "To save me from yourself." "I wanted to set you free," he admitted, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. "I wanted you to go to Yorkshire, recover, and live a life where you weren't constantly preparing a nursery for a corpse." "You colossal idiot," Margaret breathed. Smith blinked, thrown by the sudden venom in her tone. She threw the blankets off her legs, ignoring the sharp pull in her pelvis, and swung her feet out of bed. She stood up. Her legs were shaky, her center of gravity entirely different now that her stomach was empty, but she walked across the room. The floorboards were freezing against her bare feet. She stopped 2 feet from him. She could smell the peat of the scotch, the sharp scent of his anxiety, and the familiar grounding smell of wool and rain that always clung to him. "You don't get to make my sacrifices for me," she said, looking up into his bloodshot eyes. "You don't get to decide what I can and cannot endure. I wanted those babies just as much as you did. I bled for them. I grieved for them. And when you left, you didn't save me. You just made the grief lonely." Smith closed his eyes, a grimace of pure agony twisting his features. A single tear slipped free, tracking down the stubble on his jaw. "I'm sorry. God, Maggie, I am so sorry." "I know," she said quietly. She reached out, her palm flattening against his chest, right over his heart. It was beating violently, a frantic, terrified rhythm beneath the fine linen of his shirt. "You've proven that over the last month. You stayed." He opened his eyes, looking down at her hand, then up at her face. "I'm never leaving again. If you want me to sleep in the hall for the rest of our lives, I will. But I am not leaving." "The hall is drafty," Margaret said, a weary, cynical half-smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. She dropped her hand. "Come to bed, Smith. He's breathing. And so are we." Spring arrived in late March, melting the soot-stained snow off the roofs of Berkeley Square. The heavy velvet curtains in the blue room were finally drawn back, allowing the pale, watery London sunlight to wash across the carpet. The braziers had been removed. The oppressive, stifling heat was replaced by the crisp, cool scent of damp earth and blooming wet stone from the streets below. Margaret stood by the window, a cup of weak tea in her hands. She wore a simple morning gown of slate blue, the heavy black bombazine morning dresses having been quietly packed away by Mrs. Gable. She looked different. The exhaustion was still there, carving subtle shadows beneath her cheekbones, but the brittle porcelain fragility had vanished. She felt grounded, solid. A sharp, demanding cry rose from the center of the room. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply turned and watched as Smith, already dressed in a tailored charcoal suit for a morning at Parliament, quickly abandoned his briefcase on the sofa. He crossed the room to the large, sturdy mahogany crib that had replaced the precarious bassinet. He reached in, lifting Henry out with a practiced, easy confidence that still made Margaret's throat tight. Henry was a completely different child. The translucent fragility had been replaced by a solid, warm density. He had Smith's dark hair and Margaret's stubborn, cynical set of the jaw. He was a survivor, and he demanded to be known. I know, Smith murmured, bouncing the boy gently against his shoulder, patting his back with a large, heavy hand. The baby immediately quieted, gnawing aggressively on the lapel of Smith's expensive coat. He's hungry again. He's eating me out of house and home. He's making up for lost time, Margaret said, walking over to them. She stopped beside Smith. They fit together differently now. The jagged defensive edges had been worn down by sleep deprivation, shared terror, and the gritty, unromantic reality of keeping a human being alive. There were no sweeping declarations of eternal romance, no poetic metaphors about souls entwining. It was a love forged in blood, ash, and sour milk. It was imperfect. It was real. Smith turned his head, his lips brushing against Margaret's temple. I have the solicitor coming this afternoon. Margaret's hands tightened slightly around her teacup. The words still carried a phantom sting. "Oh?" "Not for that," Smith clarified immediately, sensing the shift in her posture. He shifted Henry to his other arm, wrapping his free hand around Margaret's waist, pulling her flush against his side. The solid warmth of him was deeply reassuring. To amend the will, to register Henry officially, and to dissolve the separation agreements entirely. I want the paperwork burned, officially this time. "You already burned it in Yorkshire," she reminded him dryly, "along with a perfectly good Persian rug, if I recall." Smith let out a low, genuine laugh. It was a sound she hadn't heard in years, rich, deep, and unburdened. "I'll buy you a new rug. I'll buy you 100 rugs." "I don't want rugs," Margaret said, looking down at the heavy gold ring stuck on her finger. The swelling had gone down weeks ago, but she had never taken it off. She didn't intend to. "I just want you to come home for dinner." Smith's smile softened, the cynicism fading into a look of profound, quiet devotion. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the scars, the exhaustion, and the fierce, undeniable strength that held them all together. "Try and keep me away," he whispered. Henry let out a loud, impatient squawk, swatting his tiny fist against Smith's chin. Margaret laughed, a clear, ringing sound that echoed perfectly in the sunlit room. She set her teacup down and reached for her son. The Duke of Somerset surrendered his heir without a fight, stepping back to watch his wife cradle the impossible life they had built from the ashes. The fire was out, the rot was cleared, and on the solid, muddy ground they had fought so viciously to claim, they finally began to grow. If you found yourself captivated by Margaret and Smith's gritty, hard-won journey from the ashes of a broken marriage, please hit that like button to let us know. Storytelling like this thrives on your support. Share this video with fellow historical romance fans who crave real, deeply human drama over fairy tale perfection. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our original audio stories. Drop a comment below.